role in training for that historic mission. And a half-century later, the city of Flagstaff, Arizona is still celebrating.
Okay, Houston, I'm on the porch.
Mission Control might have never witnessed this.
Okay, there we see you coming down the ladder now.
Or this.
That's one small step for man.
If not for the vision of men like Gene Shoemaker.
It is safe to say, without Gene Shoemaker, the moon landing as we know it would not have existed.
As we know it, there probably would have been a moon landing.
A pretty big claim, but that's the way geologists Ivo Lucchitta and Jerry Shepard remember it. In fact, they say their boss, a top gun at the U.S. Geological Survey, made a lot of stuff happen on that historic mission.
Originally, they didn't even want them to pick up any.
Didn't want any television.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Not kidding. We worked very hard here to use television in our field exercises and show them how valuable it was. And can you imagine no television, the famous steps down,
As bad as they were.
as bad as they were, that is absolutely iconic.
As the story goes, Shoemaker had a lot of convincing to do.
He had to convince NASA because originally it was just a rock.
It seems so elementary to us today.
They didn't want to take a rock hammer. They didn't want to take anything that hurt their suit and poke a hole in their suit. They didn't want us to even photograph the rocks.
Gene would talk to people there about the fact that there's no point in going to the moon unless you're going to do some science.
Carolyn Shoemaker, Gene's widow, knows a thing or two about heavenly bodies.
Those are probably ones that
She helped discover one, a comet that broke apart in 1994 and crash landed on Jupiter bears her name.
What was the sales pitch he delivered that got them?
the idea that man could do a lot on the moon if they were given the chance.
Shoemaker found that chance in an Arizona town called Flagstaff, nestled between Phoenix and the Grand Canyon. The town is in full celebration of the moon landing's golden anniversary.
Yeah, this is the homage to all of our work associated with getting people to the moon.
Jeff Hall is caretaker of the Lowell Observatory, which has artifacts from the Apollo mission on display.
And this is the guest book?
This is the guest book. Astronauts came out here and signed. You can see Neil Armstrong right there. Flagstaff provided the astronauts a near perfect venue to see what they were going to run into on the moon.
And now we're coming up to the old Clark telescope, gentlemen.
Lowell's telescope, one of the oldest in the nation, helped geologists map the moon for the Apollo 11 landing.
You only get one shot when you're up there on the moon, and you better get it right. And this was a perfect place to do that.
But Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins weren't geologists. It was up to people like Shepard and Lucchitta to train them.
Initially, they were not that enthusiastic about doing geology. They were jet jockeys.
I think the term is fly jobs.
Well, you can select whichever term you want. In any case, they were not particularly interested, but once they got into it, they found out it was really a lot of fun.
In other words, they got a crash course in geology. They trained at a nearby cinder field and studied rock formations at the Meteor Crater, a breathtaking hole in the earth nearly 4,000 feet in diameter and more than 500 feet deep. It's believed to have been created from an impact approximately 50,000 years ago.
Gene Shoemaker used this as his laboratory to show the astronauts how to identify the different rocks once they got to the moon.
Meteor Crater tour guide Jeff Beal says they didn't have much time to learn.
They were here for about 2 days. They're here at the crater.
2 days?
Yeah, 2 days. Yeah, actually, yeah. It was,
That's a hell of a crash course.
But the trainees also brought common sense.
Buzz Aldrin actually walked past this tied-out limestone and ripped his spacesuit open. So they realized that they had to redesign their spacesuit to make it much tougher.
Coming up on 5 minutes to ignition. Gene Crown's getting a go, no-go for this app.
With that knowledge in hand, they were off. But there was no guarantee they'd have a chance to use it.
I was watching this guy sitting in mission control saying, you got to pick a landing site, really soon we're running low on fuel.
20 feet down, go down. 3,000
And very calm Neil Armstrong just kept flying until he found a safe place. They said you had 30 seconds, 20 seconds to fuel. he got down to 6 or 8 seconds before he landed the moon.
With that promise.
All of it was captured on TV. Coverage from New York. His colleague George Herman broadcasted live from the U.S.G.S. in Flagstaff. But Jerry Shepard was doing his own thing from Mission Control in Houston.
I was watching their heartbeats because I had nothing to do until they landed. Our crash, Niels was going just barely over an average rate. Aldridge was going like this.
The eagle has landed. Everybody was crying.
Crying.
I wasn't sure what dimension I was in.
All that science, all that know-how continues to inform those here in Flagstaff, where the mission continues.
These cinders simulate the surface. I mean, with a renewed pledge for space exploration, the U.S.G.S. is once again training astronauts. Lauren Edgar has already started the countdown. So they'll be training in the same spaces and places that the Apollo 11 team did.
Absolutely. And so I think it'll be pretty inspirational for them to be literally walking in the footsteps of these explorers that went before them, and hoping someday to, go back out there and make their own.
And that brings us back to Gene Shoemaker.
He really wanted to be the first man on the moon.
Really?
Yes.
A medical condition denied Shoemaker from any shot of getting to space. But after he died in a car crash in 1999, a lunar probe carried his ashes there.
Your husband is the only human being who's buried on the moon.
Yes.
Well, by that introduction, you've already met our speaker, or at least heard from her. Ivo Lucchitta was born in Czechoslovakia in 1937, right before the Russians came, or the Nazis came to visit. His parents are Northern Italian, Czech, and Russian. Quite an interesting lineage. He's also what I would call a bit of a Renaissance fan. His baccalaureate is in classics that he got in Rome. He had a brief stint studying composition and conducting. Then he made this short jump into aeronautical engineering. And then migrated with his mother to the U.S., where he just waltzed into Caltech as an undergraduate and studied physics. Was that under Feynman? Was that under Feynman?
One of them.
Yeah, one of them. But then, of course, he got religion and he switched to geology. After attaining his B.S. in geology in 1961, he went to Penn State, where he earned his Ph.D. in geology with a dissertation on the geological history of the Grand Canyon. If you want to know how the geologist Jackson Hole met Ivo and his wife, Arabelle, they were our leaders on the very first big field trip that Peter Ward set up, going down the Grand Canyon. We had a delightful 2 weeks. You guys really missed a great one. In 1966, he and Arabelle moved to Flagstaff, where they worked on the U.S.G.S. programs, conducting geological research on the moon as part of Apollo. At the end of the Apollo in 1972, he returned to his terrestrial studies from a field perspective that included geological mapping of the western Grand Canyon region and a portion and in part to determine whether Earth, that's the Earth imaging satellite that was put up to see things, to see if you could actually do geology with the Earth's satellite. Detailed mapping studies in the remarkably highly extended terrains of the western central Arizona and continuing studies mapping the Grand Canyon until he retired. Needless to say, it was a bit of a late motif. He retired in 1995 after producing 150 publications. but he continues to do geological research, publishing research papers. He says, I'll live slowly. Very slow. It is, it's faster than me. He is currently concerned with passing on to the public his experiences as a member of the Apollo geologic team. Please join me in welcoming Lucchitta.
Can you hear me?
Is it okay? All right. Well, I'm really quite astonished and happy to see this many people here tonight because, you know, Apollo was forgotten and ignored for 50 years. Nobody knew anything about Apollo anymore. It ended in 1972 because basically Congress was saying, why should we fund this kind of stuff any longer? We've been there, we've done that, on to something else. Well, needless to say, we had not by any stretch of the imagination learned everything there was to learn about the moon, and therefore the Earth, the solar system, and so on. So it is with pleasure that I see this resurgence of interest in the moon and in the Apollo studies. Now, let's see if I can read this. At the present time, if we listen to TV at all, there's almost a feeding frenzy. Every day, every hour, there's more and more and more programs having to do with Apollo. Some of them, in my opinion, are truly outstanding, like the sequence that we've just watched on PBS. And some of them are more along the line of rah-rah, you know, somewhat trivial stuff. Nevertheless, it is, you know, really nice to see this happening. And it is nice to be able to once again talk to people who are interested in Apollo. That happened 50 years ago. I mean, it's really quite amazing. But now, I should emphasize that what we did in the Apollo program at the U.S.G.S. was not really a matter of individuals. It was a matter of a team effort. And it is as such that I think I would like you to view what I'm going to say. Now, some people feel that the science results alone from Apollo were worth the entire program. Forget all of the other stuff. A lot of people won't agree with that, and in fact a lot of people did not agree with it at the time. But now, in the retrospective of 50 years, we realize that we truly learned a great deal about the Earth, the Moon, and the solar system on the basis of what the Apollo astronauts did up there on the Moon. Now, one thing that one has to remember is that very few of the astronauts and very few of the U.S.G.S. people who were involved in Apollo are still alive. There has been a tremendous mortality rate, which is not surprising when you think that when Apollo flew, oh gosh, the junior people at the U.S.G.S. were maybe in their 20s, the more senior people were in their 30s, and you add 50 years to that and you get very quickly a result that is not very promising for being still alive. So I think that it is really appropriate to remember that 2/3 of the people alive today were not born when Apollo 11 flew. Think of that. Think of that. They were not even born. And so I think it is our obligation, those few of us who are still left, to try and pass on what happened, why, what the feeling was like at the time, basically what it was like to be alive and working on these kinds of things in the 60s, a long time ago. Now, the problem, of course, is that 50 years ago is a long time, and I'm not a young guy. So memory is not, by any stretch of the imagination, perfect. In fact, it's lousy. But I think that the advantage is that in this length of time, there has been a filtering effect, so that you end up understanding what was in fact important, what was not, and you try and convey that to people such as you. So, well, what am I going to talk about tonight? I'm going to talk about a few things that I believe are quite important. I will talk about why and how the Apollo program came into being, to begin with. Then I am going to mention how and why scientific research, geologic research, was incorporated into the program, which it was not at all to begin with. Then, why Flagstaff, this little bitty town out in the middle of nowhere? What's with it? You know, why there? There is an answer to that. Then the question is, what were the tasks of the U.S. Geological Survey Apollo program? What were we trying to do and why? Then I would like to talk about what the world was like then. What tools did we have? And you'd be amazed, those of you who were not around at the time, at how primitive things actually were in terms of what we could use. Then I would like to also mention what was done to make geological work on the moon possible. That is what we actually did in Flagstaff a lot. What tools, basically what do we do? And finally, I would like to mention to you something about the astronauts themselves. They came to Flagstaff all the time. There were training exercises. We got to know them. We talked to them, etc. And everybody is always extremely interested in that. What kind of people were they? Okay, so now, how do I start this thing?
Down arrow.
Down arrow. Okay. That, by the way, is an illustration that I think captures the feeling of things fairly well. It is the frontispiece of a book that I've been writing forever and maybe never will finish, but nevertheless I think it's quite nice. The mountains at the bottom are the San Francisco peaks that form the background to Flagstaff. The moon is of course greatly enlarged, but then there is the lander, the LEM, spidery thing that is what actually landed on the moon during all of the Apollo missions except for Apollo 13, which never made it. Okay, down arrow. There were two streams that led to the birth of Apollo in this country. One was Cold War, and the other one was science. The Cold War is fairly obvious. Science perhaps is not quite so obvious. Cold War. The Russians in the late 50s and early 60s were miles ahead of us. I mean, there was simply no comparison whatsoever. And that was dangerous if you are in a Cold War, because they could apply the technology that they were developing for lunar exploration or what have you to producing ICBMs that could bomb the United States with atomic weapons. Not good. So, anybody recognize that noise? All right, Sputnik. And that is how the Russians first did this to us. They really did. Sputnik had no function whatsoever, other than being, what do I do now? Down arrow? Okay. All right, you'll have to listen to it a second time. Down, yeah, okay. There we go, thank you. There it is, Sputnik, a weight of about, I think it was 43 kilograms, didn't have anything other than a radio transmitter and a noise maker. But it was impressive. And I remember I was walking, I was an undergrad, I was walking from one building to the other at Caltech, and they were transmitting the sound. And literally the hair stood up on the back of my head. Why? Because that was the first time in human history, not just human history, the history of life on Earth, that we had been able to place something up there out of the immediate grip of gravity. It was a watershed in history. That was impressive. So, Sputnik 1, and there's all kinds of information that I can't really read from here, but maybe you can. And what you have to do is to look at the weight. Okay, Sputnik was 83 kilograms. I couldn't find anything better. But all of these things were in orbit, Earth orbit. They made many orbits around the Earth. They spent a lot of time up in the sky, up in the space. So it was an impressive achievement that the Russians had. Now we come to really serious stuff. The second Sputnik was one in November 57, 1 month after the first one that made that beeping noise, and it contained a living organism. That's what it looked like. All the Sputniks look kind of like that, yeah, basically. But this one was special because if you opened it up, that is what you saw. You saw the little dog Laika. And that was the Russian experiment to see whether they could maintain a living organism, an advanced organism in space. It was a forerunner to sending astronauts. Well, poor Laika did not last very long. The Soviets maintained it was a long time, but then later on they fessed up and said, no, it was hours, because the cabin overheated. Nevertheless, there was a living organism, an advanced organism in space, orbiting the Earth. And so Sputnik 2 with the dog Laika, you could read the characteristics of it. I'm not going to from here. But then came another Sputnik 3, which is loaded with geophysical instruments. That was a research tool, and they came awfully close to discovering the Van Allen belt that was discovered by us a little bit later. Now, what happens next? Well, that was Sputnik 3, okay. What happened next? Well, come on. Should be advancing. Was something quite amazing. A human in space. For the first time in human history, for the first time in the history of life on Earth. And that is not all. Because if you read the lower lines there, the Russians or the Soviets achieved a whole bunch of firsts that are of great importance, very difficult to do, and they were there first. And by the way, that does not include the first woman in space. I apologize deeply. It should have been in there, but it wasn't. So, at this point, we're not talking about Sputniks anymore. We're talking about something called the Vostok in Russian. And you get the characteristics of it there. It was a pretty hefty device. It went into low Earth orbit. It carried an astronaut by the name of Gagarin through more than one revolution around the Earth. And Gagarin eventually came back to Earth safe and sound. This was a huge achievement. And this is what the Russians, I don't know what they have now, but what they had at some time in the past by way of an exhibit of Vostok 1. It's some kind of a warehouse, as near as I can tell. If we had had that, it would be its own building in the Smithsonian. But that's what the Soviets did. Then you can see the vehicle. In front, there's a little bit of literature. On the left, there is some kind of a diagram. I don't know what the thing with the antenna is. Maybe it's a TV receiver. But the interesting thing is on the right, in the back. That is an aircraft type ejection seat. And the Russians very neatly solved the whole problem of re-entry, because when the craft was about 7 miles above the surface of the Earth, boom, fired the ejection seat, and Gagarin came down very happily in his parachutes, while this thing went down all by itself. It was a very elegant solution, actually. So that's what they did. And this is something that I like. We were not so impressed with Gagarin and with that achievement for obvious reasons. That was the Cold War. But the rest of the world was very impressed. And they had statues and monuments and what have you to Gagarin all over the place. This happens to be in Mumbai, India, and I think it's a very nice representation. Gagarin was a nice guy, and I think it comes across in this particular sculpture. So, what did we do when the Russians were doing all of this stuff? Well, you can see it right there. Alan Shepard in May 61, after Gagarin and what have you, went up in a fairly small device, reached a height of 101 miles, came right back down to Earth, 300 miles downrange, and was in space for 15 minutes. The Russians had been orbiting the Earth, I mean, there was no comparison. They were way, way ahead of us. And this was not good. This was not good during the Cold War. So the politicians got mobilized. And Kennedy made a couple of well-known speeches in which he basically said, look, this country is going to get going, and we're going to get some people, some humans, landing on the moon and returning safely back within this decade, the 1960s. Pretty hot stuff. Not so easy to do. We did not have the technology or anything else. And he got the country behind him basically on the strain of patriotism. We've got to do this. And there you are, Apollo 11, the flag, and so on and so forth. However, it wasn't long before people started realizing, you mean we're going to go to the moon and land there and not do any science? That's outrageous. Can't do that. And so, stream 1 was political, stream 2 was scientific. Stream 2 was, let's do some science on the moon. For the first time that organisms can get onto another celestial body. We cannot ignore that. And the person who more than anyone else was responsible for getting this in the hopper was this guy, Shoemaker, Gene Shoemaker, an absolutely astonishing individual. There he is. It's a nice picture of him. He was a very smooth talker. By the way, that bolo tie, I remember it well. I wish I had it, but I don't. And he managed to persuade NASA that, by golly, we really should do some science if we're going to go to the moon. Nowadays it seems pretty obvious, but it wasn't then. NASA was not at all receptive to this idea. Here's a brief vita for Gene. You can see he went to Caltech. He was there, 12 years before me or something like that. Got a BSc and a master's there, and then got a PhD at Princeton. But in between those two, a very important thing happened. He joined the U.S. Geological Survey. And he was detailed to Grand Junction, the great metropolis of the West. And his job there was it was camouflaged. It was called the Colorado Plateau Project, but in reality, it was finding uranium. Remember, this was the Cold War, and uranium was a very important mineral because you could make nuclear weapons out of it. It was well known that uranium tends to occur in volcanic terrains, so he did a pretty nice job of studying the Hopi Buttes, but it just so happens that Meteor Crater, the best exposed impact crater anywhere, is a very short distance from the Hopi Buttes. So Gene sauntered over there one day, I guess, and said, this has to be studied. It had been looked at before by great luminaries in geology like Gilbert and what have you, and most of them had concluded that it was actually a volcanic phenomenon. Well, Gene proved that it was anything but. It was an impact crater in association with Ed Chow, a geochemist, and they did that by finding coesite, which is a high pressure form of quartz, which only occurs in impacts or nuclear explosions. So at that point, Meteor Crater was definitely an impact feature. Well, so Gene basically invented the field of astrogeology, And I have to argue with him about the astrogeology part, because astros are stars. Stars have physics and have chemistry. They don't have geology. So the term that is used nowadays is planetary geology, which is much more correct. So Gene was the head of the U.S.G.S. Flagstaff branch, or originally branch of astrogeology, until he got tired of fighting NASA. It was a constant battle with NASA. NASA really didn't want to do science. They just wanted to go there and come back. An engineering problem, not a science problem. So eventually in 1969 he left, went back to Caltech as a professor, chairman of the department, worked with his wife, his distinguished wife Carolyn, a distinguished astronomer, and eventually died in Australia in 1997 on a back road in the red center of Australia, driving to yet another impact feature. He was studying impact features in Australia for years and years and years. So ended his life. But it was not a wasted life. He had a great interest in the geology of planets. And Beryl and I camped with Gene and Carolyn several times out in the weeds of the Colorado Plateau. And I remember we were looking at the stars, the beautiful starry sky, pre-pollution by power plants. It was really unbelievable. It was truly something to behold. And Gene sort of wanted to be an astronaut, but he couldn't because of a physical problem, Addison's disease. And Carolyn told me that one day they were out camping somewhere on the plateau, and the full moon was up, and Gene looked at that and said, you know, we really need to go there. We really need to go and look at that thing. And so he invents a whole new field of science. Now, how many scientists can claim that distinction? Very few. Gene did. And so he invented astrogeology, and I say that planetary geology is really a better thing to use. Now, Shoemaker not only talked NASA into considering the possibility of doing science on the moon, he even persuaded Grandma U.S.G.S. on considering the possibility of having a branch of the U.S.G.S. devoted to planetary geology. Now, this was not a mean achievement, believe me, because the U.S.G.S. had its hands full doing terrestrial work, Geological Survey, G-Earth. That was its mission. But Gene prevailed, and I think the U.S.G.S. was encouraged in this because they understood that there was money available. NASA was throwing money around like crazy at that time because they had to do an awful lot of work in a very short time, and money was one of the answers to getting it done. So I think the survey basically said, okay, we can try this, and if it doesn't work, we can always shut it down. Well, they didn't. The outfit is still there in Flagstaff. Now, the first home for the U.S.G.S. was in Menlo Park, where we have a big office, but that was temporary. Eventually, they moved to the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff, which I was using at the home base for my PhD field work at the time. And I kept wondering, who are these weird people wandering around? Nobody knows who they were. And little did I realize that in a couple of years, I would be a member of the outfit that they were a member of. So they were my future colleagues. And then the final home for the U.S.G.S. was in Flagstaff, one of the mesas. Now, why Flagstaff? A little town out in the middle of nowhere.
They went the wrong way.
Went the wrong way. You got it. It's precisely right. Actually, what happened? Okay. There was a debate, thank you. What would I do without you? I'm not looking at that. There was a debate at the time still as to whether the craters on the moon were of volcanic or impact origin or both. Secondly, in Flagstaff there were several astronomical observatories such as Lowell and the Naval Observatory, which were there because of the good visibility in Flagstaff. And so there was the opportunity of doing work with astronomers, in conjunction with astronomers. And finally, Gene and Carolyn liked Flagstaff. You know, that's not a bad reason at all. So to Flagstaff, the U.S.G.S. came. Now, At that time, we still didn't really know about the lunar craters. What was the origin? And it so happens that Flagstaff is in the middle of a large volcanic field with all manner of volcanic craters exposed that you could go and look at and study and find out what the critical criteria were. And in addition to that, it is a short distance away from the best meteorite impact crater in the world, Meteor Crater. So it was a natural. There you could study both alternative possibilities and come to some reasonable conclusion. Now, what I would like to do, and I think you may have fun with this, is to tell you what the world was like in those days, the mid-60s. What tools were available to do work with? What kind of mindset did people have? And those of you who were not around at that time, I think you might be surprised. And I might add, I forgot to mention it earlier, that looking at demographic data, it turns out that 2/3 of the people in the United States, and quite a bit more if you look at the world as a whole, were not even born when Apollo 11 flew. So what things were like at that time was sort of a matter of reading in a book. It was not vivid personal experience. So, Flagstaff, and by the way, what I'm going to say now is sort of aimed at Flagstaff a little bit because I've given this talk in Flagstaff, but I'll try and go through this pretty quickly. Flagstaff was a small town. Its population in the mid-60s was maybe 25,000 people. It's grown a lot since then. We're pushing 100,000 now, unfortunately. This is an aerial photograph. I should be using the pointer, shouldn't I? How do you turn this thing on? Turn, twist,
Push the button.
push the button. Okay? That is downtown Flagstaff for you, those of you who have ever been there. North, by the way, is in that direction. This is the Santa Fe Railroad, and this is good old U.S. 66 over there, of song and legend. And if you wanted to go to Phoenix, you went this way. This is the university, and town ended right about here. Now, it's just like an oil slick. It's spread all over the place. It was a really small place. And okay, so it was a small place, but how was it connected to the rest of the world? That's important. Well, we can look at transportation. And nowadays, Flagstaff is at the intersection of two interstates, I-40 east-west and I-17 north-south. So it's very well connected to the world, but it was not then. I put that up because, you know, the world without SUVs is almost unthinkable now, but in those days, very few outfits had four-wheel drives. Not SUVs, four-wheel drives. So that just to give you an idea of how different things actually were. And here you can sort of read that Interstate 40 was built in 1968 at the height of the Apollo, or rather was built around Flagstaff at the height of the Apollo program, but it was not usable to LA because there was a stretch to the west of Flagstaff which didn't get built until the 70s. So you could come from the east of Flagstaff and that's about as far as you went. I-17 from Phoenix reached Flagstaff in 72, but it was one lane each way. US 164, have any of you driven on the highway through Cortez, Four Corners? That was a dirt road, which would have taken you days to travel on, and that was paved in 1962. So basically during much of the Apollo days, Flagstaff was pretty isolated, and the main avenue of communication was US 66, east-west. Okay, now let's look at tools. Let's look at what we had to work with if we wanted to do anything. And of course, communicating stuff to other people is a very important aspect of that. And typing is a very prominent thing. Typewriters were the standard. There was still manual at the beginning of this thing, and then the IBM Selectric electric typewriters appeared on the scene. But still, typewriters. That's a manual typewriter, and that's an electric coming up. Much faster. There are a lot of people alive today who never heard these sounds. I have. If you wanted to duplicate, okay, you type something and you want to pass it around, you want to duplicate it, you still use carbon paper a lot, and you use the mimeograph. Can any of you remember the mimo stuff, the blue, oh, okay, see? Some people remember. And eventually photocopying. And photocopying appeared on the scene basically during the Apollo days. Here you can read just as well as I can, but Xerox was the brand that became popular. That's why we talk about Xeroxing nowadays, infringing copyrights or God knows what. But basically by the time Apollo was flying, Apollo 11, copying was done on a Xerox copying machine, but not originally. Now, when it comes to communications, which is a rather important aspect of doing anything, things were rather primitive. And rotary dial phones, remember those? Oh yes, we had one on the wall, a nice black one. They were usually black. The telegraph had been around for 100 years, but you didn't really use it that much. And then walkie-talkies, radio and television, of course, were in every house. But people like us who needed to communicate with somebody in the field did have walkie-talkies, did have eventually television, and we did eventually have radio. Or we actually had that. But look at the rest of it. Mobile phones. What's that? Whoever heard of such a thing? Smartphones? Come on, you got to be kidding me. They weren't even thought of, let alone invented. No fax, where we can live without that. And then look at the last stuff. No internet. No computers, no internet. Can you imagine today functioning without any of those things? But we had to. That's the way it was. So let's look at the good old telephone. Yeah? Remember those things? You know what? I'm old-fashioned. I like that sound a lot better than many of the squawks that we hear today. But anyway, that was the telephone. And that was a primary means of calling or communicating with anybody. It was not simple. It was not easy. When we started in Flagstaff, actually, we even had party lines. We had more than one phone connected to the same number. Great stuff. And then we come to the real gist of it all, computing. Can you imagine being around today without having some form of computer? Well, they weren't there. There were no computers. This was the tool of choice, the slide rule. And don't laugh too much. I have one here, by golly, which I'll be glad to show any of you, my slide rule. And at Caltech, undergraduates were very fond of walking around with a slide rule in a sheath attached to their belt. It was very cool. And that's what you use. And they're amazing machines. And you can do, I think I can do 31 different operations on that, which is my slide rule, including hyperbolic trigonometric functions, which I needed at that time. However, they have a limitation. You can only read them to so many significant figures. You're interpolating between marks, and eventually you run out of possibilities. So something else had to be thought of. And this is a slide rule being used by one of our guys designing our lunar vehicle that I will be talking about later. There it is in use. And if you ever looked at the Apollo 13 movie, they're using the slide rule when they got into trouble. Okay? That was it. That's what you used. But then this thing came along with something like it. That is a digital electronic calculator of incredible power. It added, subtracted, multiplied, divided, and so help me, for some inscrutable electronic reason, it did the square root. Very important. We were very proud of the square root, I should tell you. And then a real miracle happened. The HP 35 and the HP 45. I was so convinced that the God of Knowledge Apollo had gone to roost inside that thing that I bought one for $400 of those days, $1,500 now. And by the golly, I still have it. I'd be glad to show you some of this stuff if anybody's interested afterwards. that was amazing. It used inverted Polish notation. Anyway, I can't get into these little details. But a very powerful thing that would do almost anything you wanted to 9 decimal places. Hey, that's real stuff. But what happened if you really needed a computer? Had heavy-duty calculations to do? Well, let's see. There were no PCs. Nobody had a personal computer. The first widespread PC was the IBM XT, which appeared in 1983. And it had unbelievable power. There was no way anybody would ever going to use all of that power for the calculations. You know, I mean, come on now. 256 kilobytes of RAM? Who could possibly use that? Huh. And that is what those things look like. Anybody remember these things? All business offices had these, you know, the IBM. And I actually had a clone of that. I couldn't afford an IBM, but I had something called a leading edge. Looked very similar and had the same monochrome green and black screen. It was great. But then IBM surpassed itself, came up with the AT, with even more unthinkable computing power. How could anybody ever use all of this stuff? It was not to be understood. Well, if you were a large university, a government agency, a big business outfit, you needed more than that. And the IBMs, the 360s, were the instrument of choice. There were other manufacturers, but the IBM 360 was it. And it was so powerful, nobody could even understand how powerful it was. However, the input was punched cards, and you had to punch one card at a time and feed them in. And it was with the punched cards that you gave it instructions in machine language and entered data. This was not fast. The storage was on magnetic tape, you know, big old reels. And that, of course, has the disadvantage of all magnetic data like that magnetic tape. They're rather susceptible to deterioration. Not so good. They occupied the whole room, and some of them were generated so much heat that the room had to be air conditioned. We eventually got one of these at U.S.G.S. in Flagstaff, and sure enough, it sat in an air conditioned room. And this is what they sort of looked like, a small one. You know, and I don't know whether the lady came with the machines or not, but anyway, there usually was somebody like that involved in running these things. Now, how about the Apollo spacecraft? I think that is a really important question, because those things had to do a lot of computing for navigating to the moon and back. And each of the spacecraft on any particular mission had 2. Remember, one spacecraft was the orbiter that went around the moon, the command module, and the other one was the lander, also known as the LEM. Each of them had 2. One of these 2 computers was a backup for emergencies, and the other one was for the important stuff, navigation and maneuvering. And this is what they look like. And I'm reasonably convinced that those things were machined out of solid stock. If you look at it carefully, there's no welding or gluing or anything. That was a piece of probably aluminum. Could have been gold, considering how much they cost, but I assume it was aluminum. And on the right, you basically have the, this was the interface between the computer and the astronauts. And in some of the movies that we were watching yesterday, the PBS ones, you can actually see that thing in front of the astronaut on the control panel. So no touch screens, that was just a simply liquid crystal display. And they seem incredibly primitive to us today, but you know, they worked. They were dedicated to navigation and maneuvering. That was the task. They fail-safe to the most important task on hand if something went wrong. And they got all of the astronauts to the moon and back safely. Can't complain about that. You really cannot complain about that. But now look at the power. Look at the astonishing power of those devices. 2 kilobytes of RAM. I assume most of you are familiar with RAM and ROM. The random access memory, that's what you can work with, and the ROM is what's in the computer, the software and things like that. 2 kilobytes. Now, any toaster nowadays has more power than that. But there it was, went to the moon and back. And I have to tell you something, and this is not personal knowledge, I got this from the web, and I may be wrong, I'm often wrong, but I'll tell you anyway. The 2 kilobytes is explainable. Remember, a byte is 6 bits, and each bit is a yes-no switch, okay? And the yes-no switches in that computer were basically solid-state devices. I don't know whether they were transistors or diodes, but anyway, each one of them individually soldered to a printed circuit board. Think of that. Just think of that. That's why 2 kilobytes was a very large number to deal with when you had to solder each one of those solid-state devices into a printed circuit board. Now, something that is not personal experience, again, I'm probably lying like a Turk, no offense in the Turks, but what I read some places, you can read it for yourself. The combined computing power for all the computers, for all of the missions was less than what you have in your smartphone. And even if that is not correct, and there was only one mission, it is still pretty impressive, in my book. Okay, so now I've gone through the little spiel about the world the way it was. And you can understand that we were trying to do things in a great big hurry that had never been done before, and that is what we had to work with, this kind of stuff. It was, you know, we didn't know any better, but it was kind of interesting. Now, when Gene Shoemaker established a branch of astrogeology, moved it to Flagstaff, he didn't really realize, I don't think very clearly at the beginning, that there are actually 2 totally separate components to what needed to be done. One was geologic research about the moon, cratering mechanics, cratering history, geologic maps of the moon, stuff like that. And the other one was, how do we get those astronauts to do useful field geology on the moon? And then it was realized you needed 2 branches, and since in the bureaucratic world 2 branches cannot be all part of one branch, the branch of astrogeology became the Center for Astrogeology, which is still today. Now, what did the branch of astrogeologic studies do? Well, they did studies of lunar geology. As I said, how old is the moon? What is the stratigraphy of the moon? How old is the moon? When did all the impacts happen? Did they happen at a constant rate, or was there a variable rate, more at the beginning and less at the end? All kinds of questions like that. And also they made the topographic maps of the moon to begin with, and the geologic maps of the moon. Bärbel was involved in some of that stuff. Now, it's interesting to think that to begin with, the observation of the moon was done through telescopes, such as Lowell Telescope in Flagstaff. And so the telescope would produce a photo, a flat piece of paper. And if you try and mount a flat piece of paper on a globe, or even on a flat piece of paper in which you have distortion introduced by Mercator projections or what have you, you're going to have boundary problems between this sheet and that sheet. They're not going to match. And so we employed a person by the name of Pat Bridges, who was at Lowell Observatory initially but came to the U.S.G.S. later, who actually produced the most beautiful artwork you've ever seen. There were topographic maps that were airbrushed. And the airbrushing was intended to resolve all the boundary problems between the individual sheets. They were really beautiful things. Now, this came to an end, by the way, when the lunar orbiter came into play, an orbiter that was photographing the surface of the moon as it went around, and all these boundary problems disappeared, and those beautiful maps were basically artwork. We didn't use them anymore. The basis, whether it was the picture or the orbiter images, you know, the strips of photographs taken by the lunar orbiter, were then used as basis for making geologic maps. of the moon. And this was one of the big things that was done on the moon. Berbel was doing that. And of course, once you have data like that, digital data, you're really asking for image processing, manipulating the data, making them better, making them more usable. And the survey produced some image processing algorithms or software that was the gold standard, and I think remains the gold standard to this day, for massaging digital images. And anyway, this branch was staffed by planetary geologists. The other branch was this one. Surface Planetary Geology, and NASA is very fond of acronyms, so that was SPE. That's where I worked. And so we tried to develop techniques for doing geologic field work on the moon. And the problems were many. Many of the problems were not even imagined. We had to find out what the problems were as we went along. And this particular branch was staffed mostly by terrestrial field geologists, such as me, because that's what we had to do. We were doing field geology on the moon. Okay. So, when you're reducing this to a nutshell, the astrogeology branch sort of determined what needed to be done on the moon, and the other branch determined how to do it. And by the way, this is a picture of the U.S.G.S. building up on the mesa in Flagstaff, way back when there was only one building. It is gone now, which it should have never been demolished because it should have been historic on the register of historic places, but it wasn't. So, the mission of the SPA branch, well, okay, let me go on. Okay, so the problem that faced us in the SPE branch was this. The people doing the geologic field work, the field geologists were not geologists, they were astronauts. And that was one major problem. And they would be working in spacesuits. And I don't know if any of you have sort of ever caught a glimpse of a spacesuit. You cannot move very well in a spacesuit. They're pressurized. You cannot just bend down and collect something. No, it doesn't work. And you certainly don't want to make a hole in that thing. That would be very bad news. And the other aspect of the problem was that the astronauts on the moon would be collaborating with the real geologists who were in the science back room near the mission control room down in Houston. So there was a communication problem. And it's not easy to understand what somebody is telling you. They're describing something when you can't see it. So the description has to be very special, and we'll get to that in a minute. So the tools facing us were these. Had to develop tools that could be used by the astronauts in their spacesuits and the low mobility. We had to increase their mobility because they couldn't really go very far on foot. We had to work out better means of communication between the astronauts on the moon and the scientists in Houston. And then we had to train them. They were not geologists. They had to have some training in geology, otherwise they would have been useless. Okay. Now, the tools had to counteract what is really the deadly environment of space, zero pressure essentially, the very poor mobility, and something that people tend not to think of, bad visibility. Because there's this dust, fine dust on the surface of the moon. If you kick it up, it's going to end up on your visor and you cannot see anything. So they were working on the real handicaps. Now, most of the tools were designed basically for collecting samples, doing stuff like that. The stuff that the geologist bends over and picks up a sample, but the astronaut in the spacesuit could not do. And endless tests at the U.S.S. in Flagstaff. Here are two of my colleagues. The one on the left, Tim Haight, long dead. The one on the right, an old friend from Caltech, Days died last winter. And in the background is one of our many mock-ups of the so-called LEM, the landing module, the lander module. And we had these mock-ups because the first thing the astronauts had to do when they landed was to describe what they saw out of those little triangular windows. So that was one of the exercise items that they had to do. And you can see that the two guys are in full-on pressure suits with the pressure backpack. And NASA is very fond of acronyms. There was the Portable Life Support System, PLSS. I'm just telling you, acronyms were everything. And so you had to figure out what you could do wearing those things. And you may notice that that thing is a tool carrier. And tool carrier carrying the tools gave us a huge amount of trouble. And I will explain in a minute. So, here is one of the tools, a scoop, on the moon, being used on the moon. Here are the tongs, collecting a pebble or a rock. They turned out to be the favorite tools of the astronaut, the tongs. They use them all the time. Then there was the rake, where if you wanted to scoop up a whole bunch of stuff and put it in the sample bag, pebbles and fines, that's what you used. And then finally, the most interesting thing of all, the gnomon. The gnomon, a Greek origin word. And I'll tell you what it is. What the gnomon did was to replace this guy. Any of you familiar with this? The Brunton compass? I still have mine, it's here. If anybody wants to see it eventually, I will show it to you. Wonderful tool. When you close the lid, it's indestructible. You open the lid, you have fiducial lines, these things, so you can sight on something that you want to get the bearing on, and then you read. This is a magnetic needle circulating in a 360-degree dial, basically a ring, and you can read the bearing or whatever it is that you're trying to get a bearing for. And I might add that the needle is corrected for magnetic declination. That was very good. So why didn't we use it on the moon? No magnetic field. This is bad news. I mean, I had to invent something else. So, this is what was invented. This is the gnomon. And you can see that it consists of a vertical rod, weighed at the bottom, so it's always in a vertical position, resting in gimbals within a tripod. And the tripod is because you can always plunk a tripod down on any kind of a surface, no matter how rough. Whereas, for example, forelegs won't do it. And there's a color chart, and here you have size things. So you can basically use that thing not just to get an orientation, but also to estimate the size of what you're looking at. Now, how do you get the orientation? Well, you can see here's a shadow. And if you know exactly the time when this picture was taken, which Houston did, then you know exactly where the sun was at that point. And if you knew where the sun was, you could determine where the axis of the moon was at any given time. So this gives you a very good means of orientation. And that was used a lot. And here's my favorite astronaut, Fred Hayes, Apollo 13, in one of our many test sites, Ontario, Canada. There's the good old gnomon on a rough surface. There are the tongs, and what many of them did during the field exercise was precisely that. And by the way, they all carried a fake PLSS because you want to be sure that they were not too mobile. They had to simulate what the astronauts would actually be doing on the moon. And here's some, whoops, sorry, went the wrong way. I'll learn before this thing is over. Here's another astronaut with the same stuff, and this time in one of the lava fields near Flagstaff, doing the same thing. And one thing I should point out, by the way, are these things. Those are the wonderful Hasselblad film cameras, 2¼ film cameras with a Zeiss lens and what have you. That was the camera that they used to document things. When you're taking a sample, you don't just take a sample, you document it in 3D. You take it from here, and you take it from there. So then the position of this thing could be determined exactly in the field. They were very fussy about this kind of stuff. But you can also see that they really get in your way. They were a pain, actually. And this picture is the gnomon on the moon, but I'm not showing you this for that reason. What I want to draw your attention to is this. This is the tool carrier. Remember I said that all these tools were developed so they could use them on the moon, and they got to be a real pain. How do you carry these things without damaging your spacesuit? They were extremely awkward. And that was a problem that we worked on and worked on and worked on without really a good solution. To give you an idea what the not good solutions are, here's the golf cart in the Verde Valley crater field that I worked on. And you can see that, no, that wasn't going to work. No way. So that was abandoned. And as it often happens in life and in research, the solution came through an entirely unexpected venue. We had no idea that this would happen, but it happened. And this is what happened. Ta-da! There's the lunar rover vehicle on the moon. And you can see that the, if I can find the buttons, there are the tools. So what do? You drive up to what you want to look at and sample. The tools are right there. The sample collection is right there. Problem solved. Now, we had spent years on this damn thing. So that was, I think some beers were drunk that time. Anyway, so that was great. Now, the spacesuits, as I said, limit mobility and range. They're kind of nasty things to work with. So the lunar rover, which is the vehicle that was developed, greatly increases both the range and the mobility. And you can carry all of this stuff on it without having to carry it yourself and risking damaging your spacesuit. Now, on foot, the astronauts had a range measured in hundreds of meters. Really not very much, in spite of the galumphing that I think most of you have seen. With a rover, we're talking about tens of kilometers. Just a different world altogether. So now, let us enter the lunar rovers. Really nifty devices. NASA created some remarkable, that is a kind word, versions at a huge cost. Here's one. This is made by Bendix. Now, it doesn't take a genius to realize, well, the center of gravity is a little bit on the high side. For the astronauts to climb into that thing was not the easiest thing in the world. That disappeared rather quickly. There was another production which I think is out of Star Wars. I forget who made this one, but it didn't do very well either. But then, ta-da, the U.S.G.S. built the Grover. And the Grover was really quite something. And it was a remarkable tour de force. It was I was very proud of the Grover and of the people who designed it and made it. 3 people made this thing for about $1,500 in those days, maybe $15,000 today, a lunar vehicle entirely handmade. That was a good deal for NASA, whereas the other ones cost several millions each. The genius behind all of this was this guy here, Puddy Mills. Puddy was a mechanical engineer, but he could do anything. He could make stuff, he could design stuff, and he was a really nice person to begin with. And I'm glad to tell you that as opposed to so many others, he's alive and well, lives in California, 92, and goes tooling around on his motorcycle. Good old Puddy. These were the other 2 of the triad. The one on the left is Bill Tinnen, still alive, lives in the Verde Valley. The one on the right died long ago. But you can see, I think, even at the distance, the sort of beautiful handiwork. This is all handmade stuff. Only maybe some of these knuckles and so on and so forth, they would go to a junkyard and scrounge them for a few bucks, because it didn't make sense to try and build them yourself. You used what was available. And here we go. Here it is, kind of in a partial stage of completion. You may notice that the frame is fairly heavy duty. This is because the gravity on Earth is 6 times that on the Moon. On the Moon you can get away with something much lighter. And by the way, one of my many mistakes was to write somewhere that the gravity on the Moon is 1/5 of that on the Earth. Wrong, 1/6. Okay, so let's continue. And here it is in its full glory. This is it. This is Grover in front of one of our buildings. Now, these things, those are not cushions. The astronauts on the Moon were wearing the portable life support pack, the PLS or PLIS. So you had to provide something so they would be in the correct position. Our test people, when they came to do test work in Flagstaff without wearing the portable life support system, they would be in the correct position to maneuver, for example, this. That's the joystick. It's a T-handle thing. You push it forward, you go forward. You push it, you pull it back, brakes. And I forget now whether pulling it all the way back would be back, going backwards. I forget. But to the right, you go to the right, and to the left, you go to the left. It was a very simple device that an astronaut with a cumbersome glove could operate. What are some of the other features here? Well, you will notice that, for example, there are handholds and foot things for getting in more easily. The tool carrier is in the back. Samples can go in here. This is the instrument panel, like the dash on your car. The batteries, etc., were, and the motors were in here. This guy is a radio transmitting antenna, and I forget whether that was to communicate with the orbiter that was orbiting around at the time, or whether it was voice communication with Houston. I just don't remember, and I didn't have time to really go and smoke it out. This is definitely the high gain antenna that was used to transmit the television signal to Houston. And I noticed that there's also a film camera in here. I don't know how that got there, but there it is. This was a great device, really great device, produced for peanuts. And if you want to see it, all you have to do is to go to Flagstaff, U.S.G.S. Now what? Why did it do that? No. Sorry, I knew this would happen sooner or later. What?
Go forward.
Well, it's black. Well, okay. I know, but this is on the moon. This is the device, the actual lunar rover on the moon. And I think you can see that the similarities are remarkable. And for many years, in fact, most of the half century between then and now, I was very proud of us because I thought we had designed the Grover, we call that the Grover, from scratch. Well, it turns out that Grumman had actually produced a sort of a sketch of a vehicle like this. And the U.S.G.S. used that sketch and fleshed it out and used it, and Grumman was able to get our information back. It was sort of a feedback loop and improve the design. So that was a real success story. And here are the two, and you can see there's more than a passing similarity. Now, okay, communications. This was a very important thing during the missions because, remember, the astronauts were the field geologists on the moon, and the scientists were in the back room near mission control in Houston. And they had to talk to each other in real time, if at all possible. And that way, by talking, you could work out what to do next, and so on and so forth. The problem was that the scientists could not talk to the astronauts directly. All communications had to go through something called the Capcom. He was the only one who could talk with the astronauts. So there were delays, there were a lack of clarity, there were all kinds of problems that were eventually solved, and it worked pretty well. Now, I keep doing this, sorry. So, there was no room for wild description and wild communication. The astronauts had to talk in an organized, lucid way. And they had to talk and describe in such a way that they started with the general picture, the background, the environment, and worked their way to some specific thing that they wanted to talk about. And we worked this out, and it worked pretty well. And this is something I was involved in a great deal. I like language. So we worked on that, and there were more problems to be solved. But I'll tell you one thing, the astronauts did remarkably well, with a few exceptions, one of them being this. This is on Apollo 17, Beryl knows this very well. This is the famous orange soil, and when Jack Schmidt was describing this, he's a geologist who got started at Flagstaff U.S.G.S. When he was describing that, he kind of went bananas, basically. It was just too exciting. And this is the orange soil that turns out to have been composed of glass beads that showed that there was lava fountaining on the moon at some time in the back. Huge importance in terms of figuring out what had happened on the moon. Okay. Now, you might think that working out all of these things, these protocols for communications, for sampling, what have you, happened very quickly. It actually took I don't know how many tests, but a very large number. It was a long, intensive operation because it was all experimental. Let's vary this and see what happens. Let's vary that and see what happens. Is it better than what we had before, or is it worse? On and on and on and on. Doesn't want to, oh, there we go. Now, the basic procedure that we used was there was a team of people sitting either in a trailer out in the field or in a room at the U.S.G.S. Center. And we would be listening to the field person through earphones and communicating with this field person with a microphone. And here's a picture of one such person doing his thing. That's Al Chittister, long dead. And you can see that he's got a photo mosaic on the table. Here's another picture, George Ulrich, alive and well. This is a general view of our ADF, Astrogeologic Data Facility, with a whole bunch of people working. And this makes me laugh. Boy, we were young then. Anyway, the guy on the left is Al Chittister, dead. The guy on the right, I don't know what happened to him. And the guy in the middle is standing in front of you. Okay, so we would try and plot, without being able to see anything, what the field man was doing, what the traverse was, what he was seeing, and so on and so forth. In other words, making a geologic map as we went, without being able to see what was happening. However, it was not long before we realized that being able to see what the guy, where the field person was useful. And that's when we started trying to use television. And it was so successful, so useful, which seems obvious, but it wasn't then, that through Shoemaker, we were able to persuade NASA to have a television on the landers. And if they had not had that, they did have a film movie camera, but they did not have a television camera. And what this means is that the famous shots of Neil Armstrong going down the ladder and going on the moon would not have been visible in real time. Just think. That did more for NASA PR than anything else put together, I think. And we recommended that. So, sometimes we worked on the lander mock-up out in the field. And this is what one of them looked like. This happened to be made of tarps and steel frame. Some of them were much more elaborate. They were metal devices. But the purpose of this was to give the astronauts a chance to observe through those little windows. The first job when they landed and kind of things calmed down was to describe what they saw through those windows on the ground. So that was description number one. And for example, just to give you an idea what it looked like, this is a view through one of those windows in a place in northern Arizona called the Hopi Buttes. You can see that the visibility is not the world's best, but it's better than nothing by far. But sometimes we worked in the field. And there we are, two people at the table, not looking at the rover in the background that's cruising around, but listening and also talking to the people in the field. So many, many tests like this were carried out. Sometimes we had big tests with the astronauts. And during some of those, some famous professor would descend upon us like a spider from the ceiling and automatically take over, because that's what they do. It was annoying at the time a little bit, but now in retrospect it's kind of funny actually. But most of the time we did this. We worked out of a trailer in the field, and here's one test site near Frenchman Mountain. Now, I'm sure none of you know where Frenchman Mountain is. It's near Las Vegas. Las Vegas in those days was a small town. I think there were 2 casinos. That was it. And the nearest place was Henderson. Anybody ever been through Henderson? And then maybe two cafes and a gas station. And we saved a great deal of time by camping out. We did not go to motels and restaurants. We just camped out. And that trailer is where the geologists would stay, trying to figure out what the field man was doing out here. And sometimes it was a family affair. This is a playpen, right? This happens to be my daughter, Maya. who is now 53, lives near Geneva, Switzerland. And this is the very slim and beautiful Mama, who is sitting right there. So things were done nicely. We had fun, it was inexpensive, and it was efficient. That was very important. So eventually, we worked out procedures of description. We worked out systematic procedures of doing field work. What do you sample, what you don't sample, always from the general to the particular. And so the mission control, or rather the science backroom in Houston, right next to the mission control, ended up looking very much like our mock-up astrogeologic data facility in Flagstaff, but did very similar things. And that's it, right there during one of the missions. Now, one of the problems, though, was this. The astronauts would be talking, blah, 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 blah. And you had no way of stopping that tape recorder. They kept talking. And you couldn't really talk back to them except through the Capcom, and there was a huge delay sometimes. So it was really necessary to record what the astronaut was saying somehow. Okay? Remember, the technology in those days was very primitive. And what we came up with is something we're very proud of. The court reporters from the Flagstaff Superior Court, they took down the stuff stenographically. Let me show you the picture. Here they are at work. This guy has one of these mysterious steno machines that he was typing into. That produced hieroglyphics that went on this tape. The tape came around and was visible to this guy who could read the hieroglyphics and would type. And this was in near real time. Hey, come on, folks. Come on, give us a break. And you will notice, by the way, the advanced typewriter over there, an IBM Selectric. And this worked very well because every time a page was finished, somebody would come along and rip it off, duplicate it, and pass it around. It wasn't real time, it was near real time. Good enough for government work. Okay. Now, all of these wonderful procedures that we worked so hard on were really not enough, because we still had the problem that the astronauts were supposed to be the field geologists and they were not geologists. So what do? We had to train them. Ta-da! And this is what everybody always waits for, training the astronaut. But believe me, it was a relatively small part of what we had to do. But it was interesting. So, what did we have to train them in? Well, Geology 101. You know, this is a rock, or that's a sandstone, you know, this kind of good stuff. They were not interested really in geology to begin with. Then the geology specifically applicable to the moon, which turns out to be volcanic and impact. In those days, nobody knew really whether all the craters on the moon were of volcanic origin, of impact origin, or both. So they had to be trained in that. Then they had to work on simulated lunar terrain. Just to give an idea, this is what you're going to be facing, folks, when you're on the moon. And then, somewhere along the line, we realized that if you're going to do that, might as well copy specific landing sites. Copy them exactly. So not only would they be able to train on something that looked like the moon, but they would be able to train on the site that they were going to be landing on. And this was very important. Some of the lecturing, though, was also done in the old-fashioned way. This is Gordy Swan, now dead. You can see he's out in the field talking about some particular area in the crater field. But we had a lot of field trips that were experienced in certain subjects or areas. And this was a training that no plain old garden variety geologist has ever had or will ever have. It was really quite extraordinary. And so we, in the field of general geology, we concentrated a lot on lava flows and craters. And then impact or explosion craters, we would go to Meteor Crater and or the Nevada test site, where the explosions are very similar to what happens when an impact strikes the ground. And the first and favorite field trip was into the Grand Canyon. And that happens to be Neil Armstrong, a lazy bum. He wasn't going to walk. And I bet you that the next day his legs were really sore from riding that mule. Some of the other guys were a little bit more adventurous, and they walked down. And you can see this was winter, as usual, there's snow all over the place, but they really enjoyed that. And you know what happened is they realized that geology isn't just looking for fossils and so on. The Grand Canyon is unique. No, it's a big canyon, but what is special about the Grand Canyon is that you have a very large chunk of Earth history preserved without any particular deformation. So you can read it like a book. And the astronauts were sensitive to that. And you can, for example, figure out the entire development, or nearly the entire development of life on Earth in its 2 to 3 billion years. Now, the rocks here don't go back that far. They only go back to 1.8 billion. And by the way, the guys who were with me in the Grand Canyon know that I tried very hard to give people a feeling for what a billion years actually is. What is the time that's represented in the Grand Canyon? And we no more understand intrinsically what a billion years is than an ant understands what the Earth is like. So, you know, you come up with all kinds of different ways of explaining that. And something that I heard and which I really like is this. We know what a century is, right? We can get a feeling for a century. Our grandfather or great-grandfather maybe was alive a century ago. And we can then figure out that, well, the dawn of civilization 7,000 years ago, 70 centuries. You know, I mean, that's a number we can kind of grasp. Well, the time represented in the Grand Canyon can be measured in centuries by saying it is 18 million centuries. Does that kind of bring it home a little bit? And here you have 26 million centuries. It's impressive. But anyway, so the astronauts enjoyed that. They started liking geology, and they went to it with passion almost. And you can see that, by the way, they always had these darn cameras in front of them getting in the way. Those are the wonderful Hasselblad 2¼ film cameras that they used to document things with. If you collected a sample, you had to get a stereo pair, you know, so you could see exactly where it was. They were very much in the way, but practically through the entire Apollo business, they were using those cameras. And you can read who the people are. I've got a few pictures of them. Okay, now, then we had field trips all over the world, led by a prominent person in that particular field. And obviously, volcanic features were of importance, and we went all over the world with that. I mean, you can see where they went. It was a course in geology like no geology student has ever had or will have. And here, for example, is one of these trips that happens to be near Flagstaff. Some astronauts with Dale Jackson. Some of you know Dale Jackson from the U.S.G.S. He's the guy on the right talking to them. Now, when it comes to meteor crater, well, we went to several of these craters to try and understand what the differences would be between a volcanic crater and an impact crater. And I, for example, went to Nunivak Island in the Bering Sea, studying a lot of craters there that are steam explosion type craters. How do they look? What do you look for? What criteria do you use to distinguish that from an impact crater? So we did a lot of that kind of work. Here's Gene Shoemaker at Meteor Crater, a fantastic place. Gene Shoemaker is the one right there in the middle. And then we sort of decided, look, we really should train these people on something that looks like the moon. So we created 3 crater fields. There were 2 at Cinder Lake, northeast of Flagstaff, in a place where you have just a thick cover of volcanic cinders. And then one was down in the Verde Valley, if you know where that is, near Cottonwood. That was the last and the best, in my opinion. And what is interesting about these is the incredible amount of explosives that were required to make the craters. Look at those numbers. You know, field 1, well, that was a very small, 13,500 pounds of explosive and blah, 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 blah. You know, and you might wonder, why did we have phases? Why weren't all the craters blown at the same time? Well, the answer is that on the moon, not all of the craters were made at the same time. And part of the astronauts' job was to try and figure out, this crater is younger than this crater because the ejecta from this guy are on top of the ejecta from that one. Plain superposition, you know, just what you do in geology all the time. So we need to provide them with craters of different ages so they could practice this kind of a technique. Now, The last one, which is the one I was involved in, look at that. 86,000 pounds of explosive, folks, and a lot of TNT, and 50,000 feet of primer cord. Now, does anybody know what primer cord is? Ah, okay, so it's a pretty amazing stuff. It's a very fast-burning fuse. And we needed a fast-burning fuse, so all the explosions of one batch, one phase, would be essentially synchronous. And I have read, don't quote me on this, maybe you guys know this better than I do, but primer cord burns so fast, I have read, that if you stretch it from LA on the West Coast to New York City on the East Coast, the signal, and you lit the thing in Los Angeles, the flame would reach New York in 4 minutes.
All right.
Now, I don't swear to the accuracy of this, but this is something I have read. I have not experienced it personally. But I can tell you that in our explosion, in our crater making, it was almost instantaneous. It was very fast. Okay, so making crater fields, nothing to it, right? You just do it. Well, not so fast. First, you have to select the area in the moon that you want to duplicate. And you do that by measuring the azimuth, the orientation, and the distance and the size of all the craters that you want to duplicate. Then you transfer that to the Earth, the future crater field. Again, you have a point from which you measure everything, and you do this very, very accurately, and you stake out where all the craters are. And then you have to determine how much explosive do you need to make a crater of a given size, and how deep should the explosive be. Remember, there's two variables, amount of explosive and the depth of explosive. And if you vary these things in certain ways, you get very different results. So these were all experiments. We experimented varying the amount of explosive and the depth. Having figured that out, then we excavated the holes that the explosive were to go in at the crater locations, put the explosive charges in, connected them with primer cord, and detonated in predetermined sequences. This was not a simple job. And here we are, surveying. This, I think, was Cinder Lake, surveying where the holes were to be made. Here was excavating the holes. Quite a big job. And this one I have to tell you about. It's amazing. Bobby Philpott, I don't know what happened to him. What's on his thigh are dynamite sticks. And I don't remember for a fact, but I think he was tying them together with primer cord, the fuse. And if that wasn't enough, he was sitting on a whole bunch of bags of explosive. I did not have the courage to do anything like it, but he survived. What can I say? Amazing stuff. So anyway, here we are. The holes have been dug, the charges have been in place, the primer cord, they're all connected with the fuse, and kablooey. This is, you know, from a very safe distance, this was just one of the phases of the explosions. And there were several. The result was remarkable. This is what it looked like. And it really does look like the Falmaro landing site on the moon. Very similar, a very good result. And here are the astronauts working on that, and they loved that place, the Verde Valley crater field, because it had good stratigraphy. This was an alluvial fan. And so you had layers of gravel, and you had layers of sand, you had layers of clay, different colors, and they could work out the whole problem of the stratigraphy of the place. They really liked that place. That was the last crater field we made. Now, I was responsible for one very stupid thing. I've been responsible for lots of stupid things. But at one point, Barbara and I were driving from Cottonwood, which is in that direction, down to Camp Verde, which is down in that direction. And I was trying to locate the old crater field that I had spent so much time mapping. And I couldn't see it, but what I did see was a development. So I said, you know, the crater field has been developed over. Fortunately, there was a guy who wrote articles for the Camp Verde Bugle. Camp Verde is old town, and that's a little newspaper. And he said, no, the crater field is there. And you have to go and look at Ogden Ranch Road and this highway here, and if you look, you will find the crater field in between. When I heard that, I said, oh my God. I fired up Google Earth immediately and looked, and sure enough, look at that. Now, if you're not a reasonably experienced photogeologist, you might say, I don't see anything. But if you are a photogeologist, I mean, come on. Craters, 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 craters all over the place. These guys here, they're all craters. The craters are still there, but they've been horribly eroded. A lot of stuff has gone into the crater itself from the rim. Trees, mesquite trees have grown inside because there's more water there than elsewhere. But it's still there. And it probably should have been made into some kind of a national monument, but it wasn't. Okay, so let's see what happens when you make a crater field. It's kind of fun. I don't know if this is going to work. Is it going to work? It's not going down. Help. It should be the next one, which is a blank. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, it just took its time.
Here's the same detonation recorded by high-speed cameras rolling at 5,000 frames per second. They show the primer core tracing paths to each of the 61 shot holes.
60s music! Hey, that is great, isn't it? We did a lot of that kind of stuff and got pretty good at it, I might add. And it was exciting. And nowadays the media, you know, they want the pizzazz stuff, and they really like this. They think that's wonderful. Well, I do too, actually. So the result, well, here's the result. We had all these craters, you know, a huge number of crater fields. And the astronauts loved them, especially when they could do that. Tool around in the Grover. They thought that was the best thing in the world, you know. Well, the question that comes up often is, so what were these astronauts like? I met all of them, I'm sure. I would never recognize them if they were walking by in the street anymore. But the advantage that you have when you look back over the space of half a century is that you can kind of put things together in a way that you weren't able to do when you were in the middle of it and you're a young guy. And if one were to characterize them as a whole, well, they were very focused people. Obviously, they had a hell of a job to do. They were no nonsense. They were practical. They were mission-oriented. All things that you might expect. And I just looked yesterday at what these guys were. They were just about all test pilots. And you don't live long if you don't have those qualities as a test pilot. They were mostly engineers. A lot of them were aerospace. A few were mechanical. A few were electrical engineers, but almost all were engineers of one kind or another. And that kind of a personality is the kind of thing that, you know, makes you be that way. Now, initially, one has to say, they were a little bit superior with, you know, we were just geologists. Come on, you know, geologists, who's a, you know. And they were not wild about geology themselves. They thought it's sort of a waste of time. They had a huge job to do, just flying their contraptions and getting to the moon and back. And so they considered that a bit of a distraction. However, the Grand Canyon trip changed things considerably. They started liking geology a lot. Tooling around on Grover really was fun. They enjoyed that. They found geology interesting, which they had never found before. And it was a break from this incredibly strenuous routine that those guys had to go through. If you ever look at any of the videos, or movies of what they had to do, being in centrifuges and what have you, it was madhouse. They really like it because they had a holiday in a nice place. So they became reconciled to it all. Okay. Now, so what did we learn? What did we learn from this whole exercise? Well, we found out that this is a slide that I filched from Berbel. The planets were formed by early bombardment and accretion. And you know that because the moon is itself very old, and the early phase of the moon saw an incredible amount of bombardment by impactors. Planets are the order of 4.5 billion years old, because the moon is basically that. You know, we were able to date the moon, right? So we knew that it was that old. The next one is not quite correct. Most features on the moon are somewhere between 3.6 and 4 billion years old, but pretty darn old anyway. going way back to the origin of the solar system. And the moon was formed by impact and accretion. There had been a huge argument over the decades. How was the moon formed? Was it just that there was a whole bunch of debris floating around which coalesced and made the moon? Most of the planets were made that way, but was the moon formed that way? Not really, because the more modern thinking is there was a Mars-sized object that impacted the Earth a long time ago and threw out a tremendous amount of debris. The debris entered an orbit around the Earth, which eventually coalesced into the moon. So you could say that the moon is basically a combination of impact and accretion. And okay, the craters on the moon are impact, not volcanic. The maria, the black, relatively smooth surfaces, are volcanic basalt. And the highlands, which people thought were all kinds of interesting things, were really breccias formed by the stuff thrown out by some of the big impact craters. So this was a lot of interesting stuff that was learned. And as a matter of fact, some people feel that the Apollo missions would have been justified solely on the basis of what we learned here. All the other stuff was great, and it was great that we did it, but if we had only done the science, that would have been great too, would have been enough. Now I have to end this with something that I want to tell you about. Some of us did not go down to Houston for the Apollo 11, to sit in the science back room. We didn't want to particularly, I didn't. But we were in a big room at the U.S.G.S. in Flagstaff when the landing were taking places. So initially we were listening to Walter Cronkite's magnificent simulation. Have any of you seen or heard that? If you haven't, be sure to look at it. So initially it was a simulation, but then when the spacecraft, when the LEM got pretty close, they switched to real-time video with a camera that we said they should have on board. And then they landed. And I'll tell you what, the room was full of grown men, and we were all crying. We were all crying because not only this was the end, the culmination of a tremendous amount of work that we put into this, but because it was such a moment in human history. It was the first time that humans had landed on another celestial body and would presently be walking on it. It was incredible. And I personally have the distinct pleasure, honor, of having experienced both the first object, Sputnik, the first thing that was ever put into space, and the first walk on another celestial body. And I consider myself incredibly fortunate to have had this opportunity. Now, I don't know, do I have something else? I think I do. Okay, if any of you should be interested in further information, I don't know if you can copy this in time or not. I can leave it up for you if you wish. But the first thing is a U.S.G.S. publication that you can just get off the web by Jerry Shepard, and it is a total encyclopedia of everything you ever wanted to know about Apollo. It's not an organized history as such, really, but everything you wanted to know is contained in that publication. The second thing is a nice book put out by Schindler and Sheehan. Schindler is the historian, the Lowell historian, and they put out a very nice book just recently, last year or something like that, which details the Apollo events and especially how Flagstaff participated in it. Has everybody had a chance to write that down that wants to? Huh? What, Barbara? Okay. All right, now, I want to end with two things that are personal. The first one is this, is a philosophical thought. Apollo happened because the country was united, period. And maybe that is something we should remember today, but we're anything but united. We're not going to get very far if we don't unite somewhere along the line. And I hope it's soon. And the final thing I would like to mention is this. I think I've indicated to you that a lot of my friends and colleagues who are involved in the Apollo program, U.S.G.S. Apollo program, are no longer with us. So if it's all right with you, I would like to dedicate this talk to those people. Okay, thank you.
We've got time for some questions if you want. This is a little after 8, but Brent.
You talk about the flight when Neil Armstrong was landing, and he initially came in to a certain area of the moon, and then he flew until he landed 6 seconds of fuel left. Where did he eventually land, and where were you thinking that he would land, and where did he go?
There was an interesting story because when we were in the room listening to, to the landing, we knew that he probably had landed somewhere within what we call the landing ellipse, which is a probability ellipse. Somewhere in there, where nobody knew where. Somewhere within this thing. And, I eventually, before too awfully long, found out where they in fact were, where the LEM was. And I forget whether, I think it was a combination of they're looking out of the windows and seeing craters that they could describe, plus the command module orbiting overhead, which would periodically see where the LEM was. They could see the LEM and could see the craters and basically locate it. Remember, there was no GPS or anything like that in those days. This was visual observation. And I forget exactly where it was relative to the center of the ellipse, but it was somewhere within it. Okay.
Mike, you do?
So how and when did they date the moon rocks to 4.5 billion years old?
The moon rocks were back to Houston, and there were several people, Wasserberg and some, there were a whole bunch of people who worked on them. I forget, it was not that long after the mission. I cannot tell you the month of the, but it was fairly quick, because that was one of the most important things that you could get. We didn't know how old the moon was.
But most of the rocks were 3.5 to 4.
Yeah.
Not 4.5.
Well, but there was some 4.5.
Yeah, well, that's the age of the moon, but a lot of the rocks were younger.
Yeah, but I mean, the oldest rock is what counts, I think.
It was still established that the moon, everything on the moon was very old.
Barabel, you can stand up. Now, what you're experiencing right now
is age old.
It is the exact beauty that we had on the float through the Grand Canyon. They were on 2 different rafts, and we kept mixing around because the stories were quite interesting and different.
What does she know about the Grand Canyon?
Be careful.
Yes. Exactly right in what he's saying. It's just, before that, we didn't know that everything was so old.
Right.
When we were looking at the moon, there was a lot of features that looked quite young. And when we got back to the rocks, we realized everything is billions of years old. The moon has been sitting there. There's not much happening on it other than impacts for a long, long time. And of course, there's no erosion. Water or anything like that. The only erosion there is from impacts. So we are looking at a very, very old surface, and that we did not know before.
Larry, how widely dispersed in the world are the samples that were brought back in the various Apollo missions? Are they all over the place?
Oh gosh, I'll share with you. Okay, some of them are still in Houston and have never been opened. They're about to look at them now. I think 3.
Yeah, they're opening 3 in the celebration of Lucchitta. They've got another 3 or 4 that they've still not opened. And the idea behind that is that all the new technologies and how we analyze stuff has advanced over 50 years, and perhaps we can figure out more information from these untested, untouched samples. Bob?
Do you have a feeling as to the rate of the impact events on the moon? Did they all happen early? Has it been continuous? more or less? Do you have any idea?
There was a much stronger, much higher rate of impact near the beginning.
Because there's more stuff floating around to impact. Okay. It's swept up.
Was there a thought or concern about having any organic thing return to the Earth, and then, you know, was that taken seriously? Or?
Well, from what I remember, it was taken very seriously.
They had to quarantine.
The quarantine, the astronauts couldn't just get out and start walking around. They were, how long?
Time that they were quarantined. Yeah, right. Right.
But the rocks too?
No organics.
Yeah.
Right.
Elizabeth?
You obviously have a very bright and well-spoken wife. How about the women who were involved in this? I didn't see very many pictures of them.
I have to tell you a little story. Just, not too long ago, we were visited by a reporter from the Arizona Republic, which is Phoenix's big newspaper. They were going to interview me because I was involved in Apollo. She was involved, but not so much. And the whole story, the good story, ended up being about her. Because, because it's a matter, well, yeah, the early women story is always, it's very fashionable nowadays. Were there any women involved way back when? Some, not many. There just weren't. Whereas now, if you go to a scientific meeting, a geology meeting, I think the women are more than the men. As things have changed a lot. Thank goodness.
I read where they brought back, quote, a soil sample.
Yes.
What is that? I mean, is it just a range of price? There's no soil.
No.
That's a misnomer.
Right.
They call it soil. It's really what they call regolith.
Okay.
That's the real term for it. It's an impact garden layer. It's a relatively soft layer with a lot of fines in it, but it's all from impact. It has nothing to do with soil because that's an organic term.
Correct. Well, how thick was this impact debris?
Meters in places.
Yeah. But initially, the interesting thing
Several
is
feet anyway.
In the early days, there was one rather prominent scientist.
It could be 50 meters deep, so that if the limb landed in this thing, it would just disappear. It turned out not to be.
The thought was maybe they landed and they would sink into the dust. Right. That did not happen. It's soft.
Bob?
Some of that soil is being analyzed down in Texas.
Soil.
And I'm going to use soil because it's going. But what they found is that there's a difference between the surface a few millimeters and what's right below it. At least in visual, they're trying to
see the questions.
I wouldn't know.
I suspect that, you consider it's impact debris.
Yeah.
It's impacted debris, and in some places it's much deeper than in other places. And where the Apollo 17 landed, it's a very dark area, and there's thought there was going to be a young dark mantle at the surface. But it turns out to be actually, there was a darker layer underneath, a few feet, I can't remember exactly how much down, and through the impact, it got brought up, and it made the whole area look darker. But it is still basically an impact regolith, and I cannot remember what the depth is right now that they brought up at the point, but it's more than just a few feet. It's substantial. And it's not soft in that sense. It's not dust that you sink into. It's a pretty solid surface.
The astronaut's boot would sink in maybe 3 or 4 or 5 centimeters.
Well, we all remember where we were this time.
Do you?
Absolutely. Believe it or not, I was out in the field between my junior and senior year in college in field camp. We were up in Big Pine in the Owens Valley of California.
Really?
And our professor to come, and he was not happy about this program. All this money spent at one time. Well, all of us students, we got back, had dinner, and we all piled in one of the vehicles. One guy went in and rented a motel room. We all snuck in the back door, and we were all sitting there watching this TV about 8 minutes in the room. And boy, we thought we were great stuff until the power went out. And then we had to get in the car and drive to Bishop, which was about 20 minutes up the road. And we snuck in, like 19 or 20. We snuck into this sleazy bar and watched on the monitor. But I mean, the thing I didn't appreciate then, I mean, those guys that went up, particularly the first three, they had no idea if they were going to. I mean, just the thought of getting there, getting down there, and getting home was just, talk about a leap of faith. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. And all I can say, I learned a lot. Can you imagine them going there and doing no science, having no video cameras or anything like that? I mean, I didn't realize you guys figured out how to do the road. So, all I can say is, first off, thank you, Annabelle, for being here and wanting to share this with us.
Let me say a couple more things. She has to say one, and I'll say the other. She doesn't mind it. Apollo.
The program died because the country stopped being interested. And they kept saying, why should we waste all this money going to the moon, blah, blah, blah. Just think of how much money has been wasted. Well, think about it. How much money has actually been wasted? What has been wasted is the hardware that's left on the moon. The cost of that the metal. The rest of it is salaries. Stuff that was on Earth, stayed on Earth, gave people jobs. It was not wasted. Now you could say, well, we want to spend this money on salaries for going to the moon, or we want to spend it for defense, or we want to spend it for whatever. But the point is, most of the cost of these explorations were in the form that stayed on Earth. It didn't get wasted up there. So.
No, I don't know what you're talking about.
No. Okay, you made an interesting story. She normally tells this one, but I guess I'll tell it this time. Apollo 11. She and a colleague, who was actually in one of the pictures, went up to their field area in Montana, southwest of Dillon. That's where she did her PhD thesis. And they were coming back, and they wanted to get to Flagstaff in time to see the landing. Except for the fact that they went on a back road. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's Cottonwood Canyon. Anyway, it's a road where there's an awful lot of Chinle shale, Mancos shale, garbage. And it happened to be the monsoon season, and the stuff in Florida, they couldn't go on. So they had to come back. The small problem being that on their way back, there was a river called the Paria River, which was in flood. So there they were. They wanted desperately to get to a television set. And some other vehicle came by, looked at it, went ka-chong, 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 went out the other side, and off they were. So they did the same thing in the U.S.G.S. Pickup truck. And they almost made it across. The front was up on the bank, but they didn't make it. It died right there. So they were rescued by a grader or something like that, went to a hotel in Bryce, and we're watching the TV, and at 10 o'clock, the lady comes by and says, bye, bedtime, shut it down. Can you imagine? But that's what happened. Yeah.
One last thought. You mentioned earlier the technology that was used to develop this. When the program ended, everybody who was involved with that split.
No.
They went and formed their own company.
Oh, that. Okay, well.
They developed computers.
Yeah.
They developed hardware.
Yeah.
Mechanics.
Right.
Stuff that would never have been developed had this not.
Had it not been for that. Actually, in the U.S.G.S., the people who were in the branch of astrogeology, they just, they were planetary geologists. They just kept doing what they were doing. Those of us who were not, who were terrestrial geologists, who were trying to figure out how to do field work on the moon, we went back to doing whatever we were doing. So, there was a definite split, but you're absolutely right, yeah.
They built the systems, built the computers, did all that pioneering work in engineering, and what's come of it, you look at your HP35, I've got 4 of them.
Do you? Oh, but it's a 35. I've got the fancy one, the 45.
I've got 24.
Okay. By the way, if anybody's interested, I think you'll probably not, have my slide rule, I have my Brudman compass, and I have the HP45. Anyway, okay.
Thank you for sharing.
Well,
wonderful program.
Well, thank you. Right, great.